Hi, ladies. Welcome to January in Nebraska. Hopefully, you're staying warm. This week, we're going to be talking about the second half of the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Scriptures. Today, some people might refer to it as the Hebrew Scriptures because calling it the Old Testament might seem a little offensive to the Jewish people. Either way, this video is going to cover information about the second half of that. Before I go into detail about the rest of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, I do want to talk about two of the assignments for the week. So you will participate in your first discussion this week. You need to post an initial response by 11:55 a.m. on Tuesday, and then comment on one other person's post by 11:55 a.m. on Thursday. Make sure with the comment that you talk about something specific that they said, and you're not just generally saying, oh, great post or something like that. And also make sure that your post is thorough and that it's well written. You also are going to take the first quiz this week, and so you have to do that by Friday at 11:55 a.m. 25 questions. You have 45 minutes to answer the questions. I suggest looking over your notes first. Hopefully you're taking notes with the note sheets that I created. And you should have those in front of you. Obviously, you can have the book, but you're also limited by time. So make sure you get through it quickly, and also know, as I said in the first video, you cannot pause these videos, the quizzes, and you can't, start over. So once you start, you have to have the time to finish it. If you don't finish, because you get interrupted, you get the grade that it records, okay? So, about the second half of the Hebrew Scriptures. So, first of all, the first half kind of ended with the Exodus, and we talked about Moses parting the Red Sea and getting the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. But then the people wandered in the desert for about 40 years. And one thing that was kind of important to them was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was a gold box that was kind of held by these rods that went through these dowels. According to legend, you couldn't touch the Ark of the Covenant. If you did, you would die. And only the Levite priests, these would be the descendants of Levi, who was one of Jacob's 12 sons. Only the Levite priests were allowed to carry it. And again, they couldn't touch it. And then they would move it from place to place. So wherever they stopped, and they were guided by a cloud during the day and this pillar of fire at night, when it stopped, they would set up camp. They would build this big tent around the Ark of the Covenant, and they called that the tabernacle. And then they would all put their tents around that, and they would stay there as long as that cloud or pillar of fire or smoke would stay. As soon as it moved, they would move. Anyway, at the end of this, Moses takes them to kind of this mountain where they get to see the promised land. And he is unable to go with them into the promised land. He dies there, so he leaves Joshua as his successor. So what you're going to read in chapter 4 and 5 this week of the textbook is going to pick up there with Joshua leading the people into Jericho, which is the first city in the promised land. And again, they're led by the Ark of the Covenant. This ark was like a gold box that contained a few items that reminded them of God intervening, like manna and quail from the desert. And it held the 10 Commandments, but they also saw it as the throne where Yahweh sat. So it was very important. Once they got into the promised land, they entered into kind of a lawless time. And so there'd be these people that were referred to in the Bible as the judges, who would kind of rise to the occasion whenever they needed a leader, but they didn't have an official leader, because to them, Yahweh was their leader. And so there was this one judge named Samuel, and the people started to demand that Samuel appoint someone to be the king. And Samuel tried to tell them, God, Yahweh is our king, but they wouldn't listen. And so Yahweh told him to anoint two people, first Saul and then David, to be the kings. And David, when he was anointed, was just a young boy. He was the 8th son of Jesse. It was very out of the ordinary when Samuel showed up at their door and asked to anoint this young boy and said that he would be the future king. And David was actually in the kingdom of Saul. He was a harpist, and he played music for Saul. Saul was a little crazy and very narcissistic, and Saul eventually threw himself on his own sword when he was about to be conquered. And prior to that, David had already started to take over as king, and he sort of led a different army, but as soon as Saul died, he took over as king. And David, if you ask the Jewish people today, they would still say that David was the greatest of all the kings. He was great because he was very powerful. He was a great military leader. He kind of restored power and affluence to the Israelite people. And under his reign, they had their most prosperity. And another little story about him that led him to be the greatest king is that he did have an affair with a woman named Bathsheba, and she was married to someone else. And he slept with her, and then he had her husband killed, basically sent him to the front lines of a battle, ensuring that he would die, and then quickly married Bathsheba, hoping that no one would know that he slept with someone else's wife. And then this court prophet, Nathan, confronted him after God told Nathan to do that. And where most kings might kill that court prophet, David threw himself on the floor and begged God to forgive him, so it showed some humility. And this is another thing that the Jewish people might point to as David being the greatest of all the kings. And kind of thinking of David as the greatest king and being a great military leader and someone who led a great kingdom that was very powerful and affluential. That's important because when we get to the New Testament, we start talking about Jesus. This is what Jewish people were looking for in a Messiah, okay? But anyway, when David died, his son Solomon took over. And Solomon did some good things. He built the temple, which David had imagined, which was his dream, but Solomon actually had it built. And this was this beautiful, ornate temple that sat up on a hill, and it glowed kind of. It was very impressive building. And Solomon was also known for his great wisdom, but Solomon also kind of started to, once the temple was built, allow some pagan rituals to happen there, and he had all sorts of wives. He supposedly had a harem of 1,000 women, 300 wives, 700 concubines. And he let his wives in the temple worship their gods. And so this led to some problems. And the people weren't very happy when Solomon was king because he was allowing that to happen. And so when he died, his two sons, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, kind of took over. And they had a little bit of a civil war. So they divided the kingdom into two kingdoms, which were Israel and Judah. And eventually, in Judah first, in Jerusalem first, in Israel first, the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel, took their people captive. And then after that, in Judah, the Babylonians destroyed Judah. They stole the Ark of the Covenant. It hasn't been seen since. And they destroyed the temple. And both with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they split up the Jewish people. So they couldn't band together and overthrow them. That's known as the diaspora, the dispersed Jews. They did that so they, again, couldn't revolt. And also they believed that if they split them up, eventually they would start to see themselves as Assyrians and Babylonians. And this event, known as the Babylonian exile, which really completed the whole process of the promised land being taken from the Jews, is a really big moment. And so it's probably true that all of what I said was written down in biblical form while the exile was happening as a way to help the people remember their roots and remember their history. During the history that I've just spoken of, there were these people that were known as prophets. In the Bible, there are lots of people that are called prophets. Some of them are known as major prophets, some minor prophets, and really that just refers to the lengths of the books that they wrote. A major prophet wrote a longer book, and there's 4 of them, and then there's 12 people known as minor prophets. And there are other people like Elijah and Elisha who were prophets, but they didn't have books in the New Testament. And during the era of the prophets, they kept trying to get people to quit being idolatrous, turn away from their wickedness, turn to God, and the people usually ignored them. And then they predicted that there would be destruction and that the promised land would be destroyed, and that from that a remnant would be saved, and out of that remnant would come this great person, this Messiah, who would come back to save everyone. So the Jewish people really believed that this Messiah was coming, and they were awaiting the Messiah. And so some of the major elements that were really important to Jewish people at the time were temple life. So the temple was a very important place to them. When that was destroyed, that was very heartbreaking. Later in the Old Testament, it was rebuilt, but it was much simpler as it was rebuilt. Another thing that was important was the Passover meal. As I'm reading your homework, I know a lot of you researched about Passover, but this meal continues, or this celebration continues today. Passover is a multi-day celebration starting with a Seder meal, and it mimics a lot of what happened during the Exodus. Also, the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, are especially sacred to the Jewish people. They have a collection of writings called the Tanakh, which does include a couple other books, but the primary focus are the first 5 books of the Torah. As Christians, we call those 5 books the Pentateuch. And then finally, again, this idea of a Messiah, one that would come and deliver them, that they were all waiting for. They had in their mind that it would be, again, someone like King David. And of course, when we get to the New Testament, we start talking about Jesus, then we will argue as Christians that Jesus is the Messiah. Also, at this time, there were different kinds of Jewish people that your book will talk about: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And this is important to Christianity because Jesus himself was Jewish. So the Pharisees were very strict followers of the law, and they were real letter of the law people. They really cared about specifically exactly what the law said. So they were pretty literalist in their interpretation. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were also pretty acquainted with the law, but they were okay with sort of bending the law for their own needs, so they weren't as strict about following it. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were often at odds with each other. And a third group that is written about are the Essenes. And this group of people kind of fled from the busyness of the big cities and went into the desert. And their primary focus was on study and prayer. And so they kind of wanted away from all the chaos and all the conflict that existed between the other groups of Jewish people. Also, it talks about scribes. These were people that could read or write, and the scribes might have been Pharisees or Sadducees or Essenes, but there were a limited number of these people. Not very many people could read or write. So hopefully that information will be helpful for you when we start talking about the New Testament next week. Good luck with the quiz and the discussion, and let me know if you have any questions.